Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Unhidden History, the channel that explores what the textbook ignores. I'm your host, Andrea Redlin. I'm an author, graphic arts student, history lover, and I love digging deep into history's graveyard to find the details you won't find in the textbooks. The weirder, the better. So, let's give a big welcome to our new subscribers. Glad to have you. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, I'd appreciate a comment below about what do you like best about my channel. And if there's anything you don't particularly like, I don't mind a bit of constructive criticism. I mean, how else am I supposed to get better if I don't get any feedback, right? That aside, I hope you're all having a wonderful day today. I mean, life does get hard sometimes, and occasionally we feel alone on those tough days, but just remember that all bad days will come to an end, okay? Just remember that. I know some of you out there are having a rotten day right now, but I'm here for you, okay? I know what it's like. I know bad days suck, and you're allowed to get mad about it, okay? Just find a pillow and scream into it if it makes you feel better. Just don't hurt anyone, okay? You're not alone, and good things can still happen. Don't worry about it. Now, before we dive in and have you get completely lost in history, let's have a quick pause so I can tell you about our sponsor, Dazzling Designs Decor and More, which I've linked below. Now, Dazzling Designs Decor and More, which was formerly Winter Moon Designs, is not just the only place to find hidden history merchandise like that awesome purse with the flames on it, but you also find home decor, clothing, and other things that'll make your house a home, many of which are historically inspired and designed by yours truly. So in today's episode, come with me as we travel back in time to one of North America's largest and most famous cemeteries, Arlington National Cemetery. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and there's way too much to cover in a single video, but at least you won't be as clueless as I was before I got to visit, since when we saw it, it was a place my husband wanted to stop and see on our way to Jamestown in 2022, and I just had not had enough time to learn much about it before our trip. I also did a long video about Jamestown, so if you want to see that as well as get a glimpse of historic Jamestown, the ruins and such, I'll link it below. Now, when I dove into the research rabbit hole, I had to exercise a lot of self-control and trying not to veer off course, so to say, because a place as big and as old as Arlington has way more stories than you can count, and there's no way to cover all of them. In this video, you'll get an overview of the history of the place, what to expect if you visit, and finally you'll join me as I take my video camera and explore a couple parts of it, this giant and beautiful cemetery. Similar to how my Jamestown video went, but hopefully much shorter. And if I leave anything out that you feel should be noted, or if I get anything wrong, please drop a comment below, as, like I always say, sources conflict with research, so if you know something to be, correct and I get it wrong, please let me know, okay? But watch the whole video first, thank you. It's not always the best idea to judge what isn't finished, so finish first, comment after. Thank you. Now, without further ado, let's learn about America's most famous cemetery with a brief overview. What am I talking about? Brief my ass. This is Arlington we're talking about. Every tombstone in the place has a story. Now, when you think of Arlington, I bet that, like me, you think it's America's largest cemetery. But, like me, you'd be incorrect. Now, that title goes to the Rose Hills Memorial Park and Mortuary in Whittier, California. Boasting 1,400 acres, it's more than double Arlington's 624 acres. However, Arlington may be the world's largest military cemetery, which says a lot. Located on a sprawling landscape of hills and trees in the southwestern part of Washington, D.C., Arlington National Cemetery gets over 3 million visits a year. That's a lot. If you visited your grandparents that much, then they'd probably appreciate that. Many of these visitors are part of groups such as school field trips. I'm sure you probably went there in middle school. I did not. I wasn't that lucky. The ground's 624 acres, 70 sections, and over 400,000 graves seems so vast that it's like a town of the dead. With many buildings and roads, they have street signs to point you in the right direction, because it's very easy to get lost here. You go in, you're like, where the heck am I? Okay. And the grounds are kind of hilly, and though the place is very well cared for, nature's beauty has still been allowed to shine. You still got the natural hills that they didn't flatten. You got lots of trees. It's lush, it's green, it's pretty. And it works with nature instead of against it, unlike many cemeteries that kind of go nuts with all their manicuring, or over-manicuring. So, how did this vast realm of tombs and monuments come into existence? We began our journey in the year 1669. Yeah, that's pretty far back, ain't it? When a parcel of land numbering some 6,000 anchors? Oh, yeah, because the guy's a sea captain, right? 6,000 acres was granted to a Welsh sea captain named Robert Howson. As the decades passed, the land was divided and sold off, kind of like Jamestown. So that way, by the time 1778 rolled around, only 1,100 acres remained. And those were purchased by John Parke Custis. He died only 3 years later of swamp fever, and 2 of his children were adopted by none other than President George Washington and Martha Washington, America's first lady. By 1802, both George and Martha Washington had died, and one of their adopted children, George Washington Parke Custis, sounds like custard, don't it, inherited the Arlington property and built Arlington House, a mansion which, I say he built it, but it was actually built by enslaved people in the Greek Revival style. Now, Custis's daughter, Mary Custis Lee, inherited it in 1857. And she also became the wife of, guess who? None other than Robert E. Lee. Yes, that Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general of the American Civil War. Mary was forced to flee to Richmond, Virginia in May of 1861 after her cousin, a Union officer, warned her that Union troops were marching to claim Arlington Estate as an ideal artillery firing platform. Okay, let's just put ourselves in Mary's shoes for a minute. Okay, if you're Mary, your husband is the leader of the Confederate Army, but your cousin fights for the opposite side, the Union Army. Yet he still took the time and risked his life to warn you to get out while you can, because his army is coming to take over the land. I mean, do you realize that if he'd been caught by his side, he probably would have been executed by his own men for that? I mean, gosh, war has some pretty strange occurrences mixed in with all the violence. I mean, I've even heard that between battles, Civil War soldiers of opposing sides would share the same campfires and exchange food goods with one another, like especially on holidays, but I wasn't able to dig up a source for that, so don't take that as fact. If you know of it to be true, please post a link in the comments below, because it's really interesting. Now, what I do know to be true is that very often families were divided between sides of the war, just because they lived on opposite sides of the country. Like, for example, 2 brothers, like if one lived in the north, one lived in the south, they would be fighting on opposite sides. I mean, it sounds so easy to ask, like, why didn't just one of the brothers, just move back to where he was born and fight on that side with his brother? But it's not so easy when you learn that he'd be turning his back on the community that he's been part of for years, I mean, nothing is simple in wartime, and if you really want an interesting story to read, Google the Goldsboro brothers. Not only did they fight on opposite sides of the war, but the brother who fought for the Union, he took his Confederate brother into custody as a prisoner of war. Whew! Talk about your family feud. Family feud aside, Arlington Estate was claimed by the Union forces on the morning of May 24th, 1861, taking it without much trouble. So, 14,000 Union soldiers set up tents, cut down trees, and pretty much made the place a mess in their efforts to make it defensible in the event of a Confederate attack. And though an attack never came, Arlington Estate was not left unscarred. Beautiful trees were now gone. They had been cut down to form cabins that dotted the once picturesque landscape, and priceless family heirlooms that Mary Lee couldn't take with her were stolen from the mansion, never to be seen again. So, though the beauty of Arlington Estate was now diminished, that land was about to take a different kind of role than just a family home or a place for the army to hang out while waiting for assault from the opposite side. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 had freed thousands of enslaved Africans all over the country. But where were they to live now that they were free to go where they wanted? Many of them made their way to Washington, D.C., but it was becoming clear that the rapidly increasing numbers of black refugees desperately needed a new place to call home. It was soon proposed that the expansive grounds of Arlington Estate would be the perfect place to house them. Before long, 1,500 former slaves created a little town called the Freedmen's Village to call their own. And this place included schools, churches, houses, and farms, and they grew food for the Union war effort. The village lasted about 30 years, though it did have to be moved away from a swampy area to escape from the diseases that arose from living in swamp conditions. If you know anything about living near a swamp from my Jamestown video, you'll know why. Living near a swamp is not fun. Both former village locations are not exactly known for certain, but it is believed that the first location was located in what is now known as Cemetery Sections 8, 47, and 25. And the second location is thought to be in Section 4. Over 3,800 graves in Arlington contain the remains of former slaves. One notable resident of this village was Sojourner Truth, who was an active abolitionist. But General Lee, no, not that General Lee, beep beep, he wasn't to be the owner of Arlington for too much longer. Congress had passed a bill in 1862 that would permit taxes to be collected on properties that belonged to people that had basically fallen out of favor with the government. And Mr. Lee was one of those people. If the taxes weren't paid, the land could be seized, which is exactly what happened. An astronomical sum of $92.07 was demanded from the Lee estate if they wanted to keep their land. Now, in today's money, in 2024, that was about $1,900. As Mary Lee was unable to leave Richmond due to nearby military battles and her deteriorating health, she had her other cousin take the money to Alexandria to pay the bill. Unfortunately for her, the money was not accepted because, according to the new law, it had to be paid by Mary Lee in person. Insert eye roll here. Imagine losing your ancestral home over a measly $92. Because that's exactly what happened. The land was sold on January 11th, 1864 for $26,800, which in today's money is about $537,000. It was bought by the federal government, who intended to use it for, and I quote, for government use, for war, military, charitable, and other educational purposes, unquote. Would Mary Lee ever get her house back? Stay tuned. By the spring of 1864, 3 years of war had D.C. facing yet another space-related problem. Where were all the newly dead soldiers going to rest? 82,000 of them had been killed in the time span of only a few weeks. So where were they going to be buried? And, well, you know what happens when you leave a dead body out for a while. Yeah, it's not pretty. Wherever it was, a place had to be found fast before the local cemeteries filled up to full capacity. Once again, Arlington to the rescue! Woo! Now, I've told you that over 400,000 people are taking their eternal slumber there, but I haven't told you about the first military burial. Actually, the first three. This is kind of interesting. You'll see why. Now, the first burial took place May 13th, 1864, and was the grave of Private William Christman of the 67th Pennsylvania Infantry. He had been a struggling farm boy from a large family who had joined the military for a chance to better his future. Only about 46 days after his enlistment, he died of what is thought to have been measles or peritonitis at the age of 21. Being born October 1st, 1844. Only a few hours after his burial, his body was joined in a nearby grave by that of another William H. McKinney of the 17th Pennsylvania Cavalry, who had died of pneumonia at the age of 17. I'm noticing a pattern here. Two Williams, both from Pennsylvania, both dead from disease, and both buried in what is now known as Section 27 of Arlington. Any guesses as to the name of the person who was the third burial? Any guesses? Well, you guessed it. Another William. That's right. Private William Blatt, aged 19, who was also from Pennsylvania. He was the first burial to be that of a soldier killed in action, and he lies right next to the first William. Boy, that could almost be like a band name, the Three Williams from Pennsylvania. Come on, Pennsylvania, you gotta get a little more creative with your names here. Come on now, come on. Throw a couple of Bills in or something. A few Pauls, you know? Whatever. Now, June 15th, 1864 was the day in which Arlington Estate officially became a cemetery. And within 6 weeks, an estimated 2,600 burials had taken place after the 3 Williams from Pennsylvania. But how in the world did we go from the 3 Williams of Pennsylvania to 2,600 more people joining them? Enter Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, a primary orchestrator of many Arlington events. Now, this guy despised his former comrade in arms, Robert E. Lee, for joining the Confederate side, so he kind of let his vindictive side come out. The truth is, Lee was so attached to his native state of Virginia that he was willing to join whatever side Virginia chose. I mean, wouldn't you? I remember that scene in Gone with the Wind where all the men are discussing, the impending war, and Ashley Wilkes says, "If Georgia fights, I go with her." I think it was something like that, Let's be real here. People tend to choose the side they were raised with or where their life is. Kind of like, how you pick your favorite football team from your birthplace, right? I mean, trees just don't uproot themselves. But unlike Robert E. Lee, Mr. Meigs did not have the same view. To punish Lee, he had this bright idea of turning the general's home into a giant cemetery would discourage Lee from ever wanting to come back and live there again. And he did this by making sure that some of those burials were in Mary Lee's rose garden, right by the house. Nice. The Victorians viewed dead people a lot differently than we do, and they actually believed some of their crazy superstitions, like people rising from their graves, being vampires, etc., blah, blah, blah. So something like having your house in close proximity to a graveyard probably would have put off most people in that time period. Now, since I live in a more enlightened time period, I don't know about you, but having a graveyard within view of my house really wouldn't bother me at all. It's the living that scare me, okay? The dead can't hurt you. Anyway, Mr. Meigs poured more salt in this wound by having more remains from the Battle of Bull Run brought to Arlington to be interred, numbering over 2,100 dead soldiers from both sides. And they were placed in a common vault that later became the Tomb of the Civil War Unknowns, not to be confused with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which I'm sure just thrilled the Lee family. Yep. So, when the war officially ended, the fate of Arlington Estate was unknown. Would the Lees return to reclaim their ancestral home? And how would they feel about the Freedmen's Village and over 2,000 dead people who had now taken up residence there? In 1868, Mary Lee wrote to President Andrew Johnson to request the return of her home. Though her request was initially granted, rumors arose that General Lee was planning to invade the property, as well as him being in league with President Johnson to turn over George Washington's belongings to him. So, in the end, Congress got involved and the government retained the ownership of the property. Mary's mission had failed, but in 1873 she visited the property 3 years after her husband's death for one last look at her former home, to visit the graves of her parents and, presumably take a walk down memory lane. But by now, her health had deteriorated to the point where she couldn't even enter the abandoned house she'd once lived in. Probably because she was in a wheelchair, and wheelchairs don't exactly do staircases very well. So, she was very grieved by the state that she found the house in. It was very upsetting for her to see the place so changed. And 3 or 5 months later, depending on what source you read, she too was dead, supposedly died of a broken heart. Her son, George Washington Custis Lee, who now had the land title, the following year he sent his sights on reclaiming the property. By 1879, over 17,000 dead now rested on the estate. If Custis won his suit, they would all have to be removed, which would have been a highly expensive as well as probably disgusting project. So the government then played every trick in the book to prevent the land from reverting back to him. Legal battles followed, and in the end, Custis was persuaded in 1883 to accept financial compensation in the amount of $150,000 instead of the property, and that amount of money in today's dollars equals to about $4.7 million. While this was going on, a building known today as the Old Amphitheater was being built, not to be confused with that ginormous memorial amphitheater. In a final attempt to spit on Robert E. Lee's loss of his home, Mr. Meigs again, this guy oversaw the construction of the Temple of Fame, a column structure that featured the name of a Union general on each column. Maybe Lee would have been happy to know that the temple was demolished in 1967, but who can say? Mr. Meigs, the traitor, was eventually buried in Arlington as well, at the age of 75 in 1892. In the years following the Civil War, animosity between survivors and their families of both sides still understandably went on, causing many families from the Confederate side to have their loved ones' remains removed from Arlington. It wasn't until about 1900 that the dust had finally settled for good, and soldiers of both sides could harmoniously be buried there without hostility between their living relatives. 1925 marked the year when Robert E. Lee's home, Arlington House, was restored to its pre-war appearance, and people began to visit it in 1929. I didn't get to see the inside of Arlington House, as at the time of my visit, I think I only had a vague notion that the land had once been the home of Robert E. Lee, though I do remember photographing the house from a distance. It was like on a giant hill somewhere. From the 1920s on, even more significant events and changes would occur at Arlington. On May 30th, 1929, President Herbert Hoover presided over Arlington's very first Memorial Day ceremony. In 1932, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was finished and opened to the public, with its 24-hour guard beginning in 1948. In that same year, President Truman passed an order that eliminated burial segregation. Fast forward to 1986, and the monument remembering the astronauts of the Challenger space shuttle disaster was built. In the years 1991, 96, 99, and 2007, more space was acquired to make room for thousands more graves, and cemetery expansion is expected to continue. And the southern expansion is expected to last until 2025. Now, it's likely that since there's about 30 burials a day as of 2017 being conducted here, that expansion of the grounds is probably going to be an ongoing project for many years to come. Now, like me, you're probably wondering, what makes a person eligible for eternal rest at Arlington? According to the Arlington National Cemetery website, this is their policy, and I quote, "Eligibility for in-ground burial at Arlington National Cemetery is the most stringent of all U.S. national cemeteries. However, most veterans who have at least 1 day of active service, other than for training, and an honorable discharge are eligible for above-ground interment," which is where they put your ashes in a columbarium. "Eligibility is determined at the time of need," unquote. Now, obviously, these guidelines are going to be more complicated in this, so that's just a basic overview. You know, there's tons of paperwork involved, blah, blah, blah. I did dig up some interesting bits of info, though. I found it interesting that there's no fee for interment or inurnment, other than the money that the family would pay for a vault or to a company to produce the burial marker. Though, as of 2017, private burial markers are no longer allowed because of space constraints, so Arlington will provide a free one for you. If a family doesn't buy a vault, the cemetery provides a free concrete grave liner, that's really nice. I wasn't expecting them to do that, you know. Most cemeteries are like, "Here, hand over your money." But it's not just military people who are buried at Arlington. Some of these people are spouses of those who served. In fact, you don't even have to be American to be buried here. People from over 11 other countries rest there. U.S. presidents, regardless if they served in the military or not, are also eligible. Incidentally, there's only 2 buried at Arlington, Kennedy and Taft. And honestly, with so much years of history, I really thought there'd be more than that, but okay. Since there's way too many notable monuments to list in this video, I'm just going to mention 2. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which I know you've heard of, and the grave of the amputated legs. Yes, I said legs. And I'm sure you probably haven't heard of that one. I sure didn't. We'll talk about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier first, and then we'll get to the other one. Now, contrary to its singular name, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is probably the most famous in the entire cemetery, and it contains the remains of actually more than one unknown veteran. The first one was a World War I soldier. The tomb was built in 1921, the same year that 4 American soldiers' bodies were exhumed from French military cemeteries, one of which would be chosen randomly to become the first unknown soldier. In a solemn ceremony, the 4 caskets were lined up, and one was selected by the placement of a spray of white roses by Sergeant Edward Younger. This body was then transported to Washington, D.C., and over 90,000 people turned up to pay their respects. His funeral was held at the Memorial Amphitheater near the tomb, presided by President Warren G. Harding, who placed a Medal of Honor on the casket. As time passed, the monument we see today replaced the original stone slab that covered the grave. It wasn't until 1926 that the tomb began to be guarded, and in 1937, 24/7 guarding began. Any soldier selected to be a tomb guard is put through rigorous training, and to be chosen is considered a very high honor. These sentinels wear nothing to indicate their rank in order to not outrank the unknown dead. Watching their flawless pacing back and forth is truly something to see. It's like they're gliding along, like, effortlessly. It's pretty cool. Now, as interesting as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is, and since you know I love to dig really deep into the interesting details of history, I simply must mention the grave of amputated legs. One of these legs belonged to the only person buried in Arlington who has two graves. That's right, his remains are buried in two different sections of the cemetery. His name was Michael Creighton, a Civil War sergeant whose leg had been amputated after a battle. His leg was buried in a grave with two other legs in section 26 of the cemetery, grave 5232. And that's the only thing on this stone is just a number, 5232. Now, the other two legs belonged to Arthur McGuinn, and James Carey. Now, after Creighton's death, 2 weeks after his amputation, the rest of him was buried about 800 yards from his leg in section 27. Alright, I think I've covered enough on the history of Arlington, so now I'll just give you a couple of visiting tips if you decide to visit, which I highly recommend you do. This place is really interesting. Tip number 1, parking. As far as parking goes, the price varies by the type of vehicle and how many hours your vehicle is there. Tip number 2, be prepared to walk a lot. I cannot stress this enough. Wear comfortable shoes. This is not the place to wear your heels, okay? No matter how cute they are. And if you're not able to walk, they do make accommodations for those with disabilities to help those individuals get around the cemetery. I think I remember reading where you and a companion can get a free ride on the touring tram with a guest, but please check before you go. And you are allowed to bring strollers and wheelchairs, though the cemetery does not provide them. Tip number 3, be prepared to be inspected. Bring your ID and do not bring large purses or bags, because everyone is checked before being allowed inside, along with their bags, hats, cell phones, etc. Like, just as you would before going to a football game at a stadium. So, smaller bags will definitely speed up this process. Tip number 4, bring bottled water, as you're going to need it for all that walking you're going to do. In fact, maybe plan a 2-day visit, because this place is huge. But do not bring food. Food is not allowed on the grounds, which is understandable, as there are way too many idiots out there who love to litter and have no respect for the dead. Tip number 4, don't walk and use your phone at the same time, as the uneven ground can be a trip hazard, even if you're not paying attention. They don't mind if you walk, among the stones, but, don't climb on them and stuff. Come on. Tip number 5. Probably the most important thing to know is show some respect. Most of these people died so that America could live in freedom, so just leave the goofing around for another time. Basic cemetery etiquette is the order of the day here. Most of it's common sense stuff. Don't blast your favorite music unless you're wearing earbuds. Don't do stuff to disturb other visitors. Don't disrupt ongoing funeral ceremonies. Don't have a picnic on the graves, etc. Act like a decent human being, and you should be fine. Bonus tip. You might encounter some paranormal activity. I initially wasn't going to talk about this, and even now it feels rather strange to mention it, but I'm really dying to know if anybody else has experienced the same thing or something similar at Arlington, so here it goes. I'm just laying it on the table. You don't have to believe me, but here it is. Okay, I've visited a lot of cemeteries in the past, many of them very old, and I gotta say, not much in my life has ever happened to me personally, to make me believe in ghosts, but after my visit to Arlington, I really believe that there is active spirits in there. I just want to share what happened. Again, you don't have to believe me, but if anything like this ever happened to you, please let me know. I really do want to know. I want to know I'm not just going crazy here. So this is what happened to me. On the day of our visit, my husband, my son, and we got to the cemetery. We parked the car. We headed for the large iron gates, along with many other people. It was kind of a cold, chilly, slightly rainy, drizzly, miserable day in October. You know, my favorite kind of weather. And not a lot of people were there as we passed through the gates, which I was grateful for because what I did next was highly embarrassing. And this is the weird part, but it's the honest truth. Literally, the moment I passed through those gates, crossed over the gates, a huge, and I mean monstrous, like wave of sadness just hit me. It just shook me to my core, and for some stupid reason, I just started crying, which was why I felt embarrassed. It was like being hit with this tidal wave of despair, like a Dementor from Harry Potter or something, or like that Swamps of Sadness scene in the Never-Ending Story. You know which one I'm talking about, the one where the horse sinks in the swamp and dies. All the 1980s kids out there have that memory of that swamp scene burned in their brains. Anyways, I'm walking along, 10 feet from the gates, wiping tears and snot off, and my husband looks at me, stunned, I think, and he's like, "Why are you crying?" And I'm like, "I don't know," I said, and I truly didn't. I don't know. I just felt sadder than I'd ever felt in my life. And then a few minutes later, this is the weird part, I felt this weird sensation of like warmth surrounding me, even though it was cold and wet outside. And at the same time I felt this warmth, the sadness was just suddenly replaced by what felt like love, like the love of people I couldn't see. And it was like I could almost hear spirits around me like saying, "It's okay, you don't have to cry for us. Plenty of others already have." And like despite the fact that no one was near me but my husband and son, it was like I could almost physically feel warm arms holding me, like hugging me, telling me to not cry anymore. Like I was being consoled. And I remember thinking, why are they comforting me? They're the ones who died. And the strangest thing is, like, nobody in my family has been in the armed forces for, like, over 50 years. And we don't have anybody buried here. So it's not like my family has a connection to Arlington or to the military anymore. So I'm kind of at a complete loss as to why or how this happened to me. Like I said, this is the first time I've ever had an experience like this in a cemetery. And I'm not asking you to believe me, but I'm just hoping to learn about anybody else who has, so that's all. And now, here is my video footage of Arlington to give you some idea of what it looks like and hopefully intrigue your interest in visiting it yourselves. So let's dive in. Finally reached Arlington Cemetery. Say hi, Dawson. Dawson, say hi to YouTube. Hello. Where's Bradley? Say hi to YouTube.
Hello. How you doing?
How glad are you to be at Arlington?
Very happy.
Do you want to be buried here?
Maybe.
You ass. How about you, Dawson?
What?
You want to be buried here?
Nah, I think you do.
Nah. Actually, I want to be cremated. Well, let's all have a good time. Be respectful. Don't be running around like crazy. This is a place of hallowed ground. Got it?
Yeah.
Picture boy?
Picture boy.
Okay. And here we are going in.
I don't see anybody. Why is it on? He's an I think I'm done with pictures on it.
Okay.